Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we see a significant advance by the Russians here in the Kursk region. The Russians have been fighting the Ukrainians within the settlement of Lyubimovka in the Kursk region for about a month now. The Russians have made several advancements in a counter-offensive here in the Kursk region, after which they hit a stalemate where the Ukrainians managed to counterattack and regain some territory. The Russians, in an attempt to improve the situation, launched an flanking maneuver here to the north of Lyubimovka, which succeeded as three Russian APCs, armored personnel carriers, managed to drive through the area, reach the settlement here in the center called Zelenyi Shlyakh, where they've managed to occupy the settlement and flank, cutting off Lyubimovka from the supplies going through from Sutsha, as well as Olgovka from the road between Sutsha and Koronevo. The Ukrainian positions now are within Russian fire control, both here by the road, crossing over a river line to resupply Lyubimovka from Darino in the south, and the newly acquired Russian positions from the north. And the same with Olgovka. The Russians now have positions here by the road in between Olgovka here in the north and Lyubimovka in the south, as well as their positions within Kremyanoe. That means Olgovka is now operationally encircled, as well as Lyubimovka, and the chain of settlements in between the Russian positions, as the only supply roads in and out of both of these settlements are now within Russian fire control. This means that the Ukrainian positions are now in extreme danger, and they can risk losing these and force a withdrawal from these settlements due to these new developments. The Russians, with this advance, have managed to make a very successful flanking maneuver on the Ukrainian positions, significantly deteriorating their ability to conduct offensive and defensive operations within these pockets that are newly formed. Here we see the footage of my previous statement. We see some firefights between Russian vehicles and Ukrainian positions in this road. The Russian vehicles win this battle, after which two others, in addition to the original one, drive into the settlement. With this, the Russians now have 3 vehicles inside the settlement. This has enough to gain control over the settlement, and with this, the Ukrainian supply lines are now in extreme danger now that the Russians have regained control over the settlement, and it is very likely that the Ukrainians will withdraw from Olgovka very quickly, but it will be under direct fire of Russian forces from both the north and the south, and the same will likely happen from Lyubimovka, where the Russians will bombard the Ukrainian positions in both the northern and southern flank, and the Russians will gain control over the entire western part of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, and the Russians will then move on to a push towards Sutsha, which will cut off the entire supply lines of all Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region, completely limiting and ending the Ukrainian Kursk incursion and offensive by cutting off the supplies. And there are very few roads here in the site that the Ukrainians can continue making use of, and many of them are connected to dirt roads. And if we take a look at the weather conditions for the Kursk region specifically, we see that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, all 3 of those days will have rain, and the muddy season will likely begin based on that. Naturally, 3 days of rain will not turn the entire road into muddy weather, but instead it will be the beginning, and the more rain arrives and the more drives happen over the dirt roads, the quicker it will turn into mud, and suddenly we will see that the Ukrainians will be stuck in the mud in the Kursk region, just like the Germans were in World War II. Moving on to the Kupiansk section of the front line, we see that the Russians have advanced deeper into Petropavlivka, where through their foothold in the north they have advanced through the settlement, where we see geolocated footage of the Russians fighting into the central parts of the settlement. However, due to heavy fire from the Ukrainians, 2 of these soldiers were forced to give up and became POWs under the Ukrainians, but this shows that the Russians have continued offensive operations within the settlement. The Ukrainians still hold the fortified positions north of the settlement, but the Russians are slowly conducting positional fighting here near Sinkivka to gain control over the general area in between Petropavlivka and Sinkivka before storming the settlement itself from the road. The Ukrainians have lost a lot of control following the capture of Sinkivka by the Russians, which has led to the fighting reaching Petropavlivka. And now we also see fighting here near Kochlyarivka, where the Russians have captured a further forest line here to the southwest of the settlement. The Russian objective here is to gain full control over the highway between Kochlyarivka and Kupiansk. The Russians here will look to attack Pishane north of Pishane. Yes, there are two Pishane right next to each other, and reach the settlements in between Kochlyarivka and Petropavlivka before conducting further offensive operations towards Petropavlivka, where the operation will be to attack and level the front line according to the Osk River line, where fighting is already taking place within the settlements of Krochlyakivka, Koslinikivka and Klushkivka along the Osk River line. Although the Russians haven't gained a foothold in either of these settlements yet, heavy fighting is taking place on the outskirts. The same is happening in the Serbets River line near Lyman, where the Russians are heavily fighting over the settlements along the Serbets River line on the eastern bank of it. Further south here in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced deeper within Lysivka, where they've managed to capture further positions along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near the settlement and advance deeper into the settlement. The Russians are here in the Pokrovsk section of the front line continuing offensive operations, where there are several offensive operations by the Russians ongoing at the same time. They are launching the Kursk counter-offensive in the Kursk region. They are launching the Kupiansk offensive in the Kupiansk section of the front line. They are fighting in the Siversk section of the front line towards Chasiv Yar in the Bakhmut direction within the city of Toretsk, where the Russians have captured half of the settlement in the direction of Pokrovsk, Kurakhove and Volodar here in the southern parts of the Donetsk region. And there's also positional fighting in Kamyanske in the Zaporizhia section of the front line. All of these operations taking place at the same time shows that the Russians are attempting their final push during their offensive, which started with the Battle of Avdiivka in October of 2023 until now, October 2024. So there's been a year of non-stop fighting where the Russians were on the offensive, and now we are reaching the end of it, or that is what they want you to believe. Instead, the Russians are stepping up their game and their offensive operations are stepping up, not slowing down. We're instead seeing that the Russians will continue their offensive operations despite the poor weather that is coming in the coming weeks. And we saw that exactly with the Battle of Avdiivka, which continued all throughout the winter and fall seasons of 2023 and early 2024, which led to the collapse and the capture of Avdiivka in February of 2024. We have already seen multiple weeks, approximately 6 weeks of fighting here in the fall season, and will continue throughout the rest of the fall season. The Russians don't follow the rulebook of breaks in the winter or muddy weather. They simply continue offensive operations because their tactics are not reliant on good weather. Their tactics are reliant on them being able to sustainably fight with heavy forces over a long period of time. Currently, the Russians are projected to be building and producing 4 million artillery shells every year. And it is reported by Western sources that they are importing 3 million artillery shells every year from North Korea. That is 7 million artillery shells every year, or over 500,000 a month. If the Russians use between 15 and 20,000 shells every month, then they are able to do this sustainably throughout the entire year. Meanwhile, the JEK initiative, which is one of the main initiatives to give artillery shells to Ukraine, has suffered multiple setbacks, and they're not even able to reach 500,000 artillery shells to Ukraine by the end of this year. This means that the Ukrainians are 1/14 of the supply that the Russians have. If the rest of the Western supporters give another 500,000 combined by the end of the year, then that would be 1/7 what the Russians are doing. And that is in line with what the Russians have been doing throughout the entire year, and this just shows that they can do it sustainably, continuously. At the same time, the Russian army is projected to have 700,000 troops within Ukraine and the Kursk region by the end of the year, which is an increase of approximately 300,000 soldiers since the fall of 2022, and that is approximately 150,000 increase every year, or over 10,000 net positive amount of soldiers fighting in Ukraine on the Russian side every month. In comparison, the Ukrainian units are suffering so many manpower casualties that they are somewhere around 20 to 50% manned in the majority of their brigades. Some are more, some are less, but the vast majority are within this range of 20 to 50% manpower, and that is very bad news for Ukraine, who are currently struggling very much with their mobilization. They recently outlawed the mobilization of youth between 18 and 25 years old. That means that although they want to mobilize another 200,000 people over the next few months, they cannot pick from the pool of 18 to 25-year-old Ukrainians, and that limits the amount of people that they can mobilize, and it also hurts the economy the more they mobilize, which is already in shambles due to the first few mobilizations and the Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, which has destroyed somewhere between 70 to 80% of Ukrainian energy production. So all in all, Ukraine is not going to be getting any breaks. They're already talking about a ceasefire, but not one that Russia will agree to, and therefore there's no possibility of that going through. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians have clearly stated their terms, both of which contradict each other, and neither of them are willing to negotiate those terms, and therefore no negotiation is taking place. Although there are claims here and there that negotiations are taking place, this is not serious negotiations and should not be taken seriously. Instead, this war will be determined based on military means. The Ukrainians are still pouring everything they have until developing the situation, surviving as long as possible, and possibly turning the situation around. The Ukrainians simply to stop or delay the Russian offensive need 300 additional Western modern tanks. To turn the situation around and regain control over their territory, they would need 3,000 more, yet they're not even getting more than 30 Abrams tanks. Although the Germans are giving a lot more Leopard tanks, the same with other countries in Europe, they are nowhere near what Ukraine needs, and through the attrition they have suffered since the Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023, they do not have nearly enough to maintain that offense, much less go on offense. We saw the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, which in the end, as we can see, is collapsing due to Russian flanking maneuvers, and the Ukrainians have simply dug their own hole, just like the Germans did in World War II in the same region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.